Well, happy Friday. Check my notes here. Yep, Friday. If we're going through, continuing to go through Isaiah. And today we are in chapter 41. So we're making pretty good progress through Isaiah. I've called this chapter Idols on Trial, which I think is at the center of the chapter. But as you open up the chapter and you start to look at it, I think there's several sections here we can divide this up into. Verses 1 through 7 is about a deliverer being provided by the Lord. And then in verses 8 through 20, we have promises to Israel are going to be kept by God. And that's the theme of 8 to 20, and we'll divide that into some smaller pieces as well. When we get to 21, though, verse 21, from verses 21 through 24 is really the center, the idols on trial, and this is going to be a recurring theme in these next several chapters. And then it again ends from verses 25 through 29, talking about the deliverance that's provided by God. So interesting how the chapter is kind of sandwiched between these two sections, talking about a deliverer who's coming. Listen to me in silence, O coastlands. And he repeats that coastlands in verse 5. He's talking about the nations far and wide, if you can think of it like that. Listen to me in silence, O coastlands. Let the people renew their strength. Let them approach. Then let them speak. Let us draw near for judgment. Let us together draw near for judgment. Then he's calling kind of an assembly here. He's calling the assembly of the nations to hear what he has to say. Then he begins with some rhetorical questions. Who stirred up one from the east, whom victory meets at every step? He gives up nations before him so that he tramples kings underfoot. He goes on here to talk about this great conquering king that's going to come, and he's an instrument in God's hands. We've seen this in the past, where God has talked about how he used the Assyrians and then brought judgment on the Assyrians. Most think that in this case he's predicting someone who's going to name later the King Cyrus, who's still about 150 years in the future. So he speaks about that until verse 7 is the way this works out. And then he begins to speak about his promises to Israel are going to be kept by God. So a deliverer is going to be provided by God. Promises are going to be kept by God. And we see this in verses 8 through 20, a long section. Verses 8 to 10, he talks about this promise to regather Israel. Now this promise was made as far back as Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. That he's going to collect his nation from the ends of the earth. This is looking beyond a dispersion or a scattering in just Assyria or in Babylon. This is a worldwide scattering that he's anticipating here. Look at verse 8. He calls Israel my servant. This is an important theme. He's going to speak to Israel as the servant of God. He's also going to speak to a person who is the servant of God, the Messiah that's coming. This idea of God's servant is a important theme throughout the Bible. It's a great honor to be named as the servant of God. Moses was called God's servants, the prophets, Israel. And then later in the New Testament, Paul and the rest of the apostles, some of the other apostles, and the church itself is called the servant of God. It's an important theme, and it's servanthood that we should embrace. So verses 8 to 10 talk about the regathering of God's servant. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth, and called from its furthest corners, saying, you are my servants, I have chosen you, and not cast you off. Fear not, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will withhold you in my righteous right hand. Great memory verse, verse 10 there. Comfort for God's people at all times. But look how God has taken his servant. He has chosen them. He calls them my friend by extension through Abraham. Repeats that he has chosen them and he comforts them. Says, fear not. Fear not. He's going to keep his command. He's going to keep his promise. Verses 11 through 13 talk about another promise to Israel that's going to be kept by God, promised vindication. It says, behold, all who incensed you, who are incensed against you, shall be put to shame and confounded. Those who strive against you shall be nothing and shall perish. You shall seek those who contend with you, but you will not find them. Those who war with you shall be as nothing at all. So again, God is talking about the vindication of Israel before their enemies. Their enemies are going to be crushed before them. It says in verse 13, for I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not. I am the one who helps you. So this goes back to verse 10, that fear not kind of ties them together. They're not to fear because he's their God and he's with them, strengthening them. Here he says, fear not because I am the Lord who helps you. So again, these are promises to Israel. Another promise is victory of God's people is assured in verses 14 through 16. Again, fear not, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I am the one who helps you, declares the Lord. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. See this recurrence of not fearing in here. It's an important concept, I think. Lots of people, lots of circumstances try to cast fear into God's people. And oftentimes they're successful. But God urges us to bring our fear under the control of our mind. Over and over in these verses, God is giving us reasons not to fear and then commanding us not to fear. We need to put our mind on the Lord and fight the fear that sometimes rises in us. So verses 14 through 16 talk about the victory of God's people. And then in verses 17 through 20, the provision that God's going to make for his needy people. When the poor and needy seek water and there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst, I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. Look in these verses 17 through 20, how God says he is going to act. He is going to continue to act unilaterally in behalf of his people. Again, he's promising here to take care of them, and his promises were going to come to pass. And then look at verse 20. The reason he's doing this, that they may see and know, may consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. So again, the idea here is that Isaiah is preaching to a people who are stiff-necked, hard of hearing, slow to learn. Their ears are dull, their eyes are blind, and God is going to do all these things for his remnant of people, as blind and stiff-necked and deaf as they are, and he's going to punch through their oblivion in verse 20, that they may see and know how gracious he is, how merciful he is. Then we come to verse 21 here, through 24, the idols on trial. So God has promised a deliverer. He's promised to keep these many promises to Israel. Now he's saying, don't trust in anyone else. I am going to do this. It's going to be me. Don't be fooled by idols. Now, idols in Israel, on the one hand, we know that they are really nothing. They are carved wood, carved stone, painted. God's going to ridicule these idols again later. But on the other hand, we know that behind these idols are spiritual forces that are against God, that are trying to subvert God's people. And specifically, we want to keep in mind that it's God's people that these spiritual forces are trying to pervert, trying to subvert, trying to draw them away from God. I mean, spiritual forces who are already crushing people and have led them away from the Lord, they don't need to bother with those people that they've already affected. They don't have to bother with those unbelievers that have already been led astray. They're going to focus on God's people. So God warns them here. Set forth your case, says the Lord. Bring your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them and tell us what is about to happen. So here's one of the proofs. If you're such a great idol, tell me what's going to happen in the future. Tell us the former things. Explain to me what's happened in the past and why. So God's saying, tell me what's going to happen in the future. Explain to me the purpose of what has happened in the past. See if you could do that. Tell us the former things, that what they are, that we might consider them, that we might know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know that you are God's. And he finally says, do good or do harm. In other words, do something, act, do something at all. Tell the future, explain the past, do something good, do something evil, just do something at all. So God is ridiculing, and he's ridiculing them before his people here. He's ridiculing them in a prophecy to his people to strengthen them and to put on display for them the futility of following these idols or following anything that's not God. He goes on to behold, you are nothing. He brings us to a conclusion in verse 24. And your work less than nothing. An abomination is he who chooses you. Be an interesting study for you to look up in a concordance abomination and see the things that the Lord considers an abomination. An abomination is something that is disgusting, that God finds disgusting. Some of the things that he finds disgusting is homosexuality, transvestitism, cross-dressing. He finds child sacrifice an abomination, and here he finds idolatry an abomination, as well as divorce. So a number of things that God finds abominable, and it's good to look at these in comparison with one another, that homosexuality is just as horrible a sin before God, just as a disgusting sin as is idolatry. Verse 25, he comes back to the theme that he opened the chapter with. I stirred up one from the north, and he has come from the rising of the sun. And he shall call upon my name. He shall trample on rulers as on mortar, as the potter treads the clay. Who declared it from the beginning, that we might know, beforehand, that we might say he is right. There is none who declares it, none who proclaimed, none who heard your words. I was the first to say to Zion, behold, here they are, and I give to Jerusalem the herald of good news. So the idea here is God is bringing he's talking about a deliverer. This deliverer is going to come from the north, from the rising of the sun. So he's going to come from the east, come attack Israel, come down through Israel through the north to deliver his people. And God is providing him. God is going to be the force, empowering agent behind this coming deliverer. So, again, the chapter opens and closes with a deliverer, a promise of a deliverer. The main part of it is God's proof that he's going to provide this deliverer by also declaring that he's going to keep all these other promises. And then a challenge to turn away from idols. I think for us, some applications for us today. Number one, prophecy is important. Gives us confidence in the Lord and confidence in his word. Fully 27% of the Bible was prophetic when it was written. And it's there for us to study, to learn. We should be looking closely at prophecy. Given prophecy, then, we're challenged to live in light of it. I think Dr. Dwight Pentecost, Dallas Seminary, has said several times or had observed that whenever prophecy is mentioned in the Bible, it's in the context of holy living, set-apart living. And when we see and understand prophecy, as Israel did, we need to live in light of it, turn away from anything else we're depending on, any other what we would call, may say, a modern day idol in our life, and instead embrace the living God and Him alone. Also, prophecy is giving us confidence in the Lord Himself, as well as reasons to warn the people around us. We should use prophecy as a catalyst for evangelism, to tell people what is coming, to warn them. The times we live in right now, people are wondering. I think survey after survey indicates that people are wondering what's going on. There's just kind of a sense that time is running out. So there's a great opportunity in front of you, brothers and sisters, if you read and heed the prophetic word and act on it. God bless you, and may the Lord continue to bless you as you are reading through this wonderful book, moving book, really, the book of Isaiah. God bless you.